So we are all very excited for tonight. This evening, Books and Books is very happy to welcome Mr. J. Patrick Redmond and his new book, Some Go Hungry. Tonight, Patrick is going to be in conversation with Ms. Kaylee Jones. Ms. Jones is an author, educator, and the publisher of the Kaylee Jones Books imprint at Akashic. Without further ado, please give a very warm welcome to Patrick and Kaylee.
So just as a little introduction, this is the very room where I met Patrick. In 2010, it was March, I came to do a reading here for when my memoir came out, Lies My Mother Never Told Me. I was here with Uncle Don, who comes from the same hometown as my dad, Robinson, Illinois, and we walked in, and Patrick was sitting with his mom over here, and he stood up and said, "I just have to introduce myself. I'm from Vincennes, Indiana, right across the river from where your dad grew up, and I bet there's nobody else from there around here." And I said, "Well, he is." And we started talking, and Patrick was telling me about his lifelong desire to write this memoir about his experience growing up in Vincennes, knowing from a very, very young age that he was gay and having to hide it in this very religious town. His family owned this restaurant there for 55 years. It was a family-run business. And he was telling me the story, and I said, "Well, maybe you should go to an MFA program." And he said, "Well, where do you teach?" And I said, "I teach at Southampton in Long Island. I teach at Southampton College, and I teach at Wilkes University, which is a low residency program. It would be very easy for you because you could go when you're off from school." Well, he applied to the wrong program, got into Southampton, and they built him, just for him, a low residency program. They wanted him to go, so they let him take classes through Skype and so on. So we studied together. He studied with me for those 2 years, and then during that process, after he graduated, I started this publishing company, which was sort of something that I'd been wanting to do for a long time. And Patrick wrote this absolutely incredible book, which is very close to my heart. He worked really hard on it. He did many drafts. It ended up becoming a novel. And we will talk about that and why that happens and how that happens. Some of you here must be writers, and you must be interested in that process and why that sometimes happens. But to start, Patrick's going to read the very beginning of the book. He's going to read the first page of the book, and then we're going to talk a little bit, and we're going to let you participate in the conversation, ask questions, make comments, and then he'll read a little piece of the book, of the first chapter, I believe, and that will close it. And after that, we'll all gather for a reception, and we really hope you'll stay around and hang out with us and talk. So, Patrick, you want to read your? Okay, you have to put it on the thing.
They've given me a microphone. Jeffrey, they've given me a microphone, just so you know. All right. Jeffrey owned Magnum on the Upper East Side in Miami. Many nights spent at the piano in Magnum. This is an incredibly surreal moment for me, so I just want to take some time right before I read. First of all, to say thank you to everyone that took the time to show up this evening. In 1999, I was in a really bad spot. I was in a bad place emotionally, physically, spiritually. And I was sort of the third generation. I was the one that was supposed to carry on the legacy of my family's business. And there just was something in me that just said I needed to get away. I needed to get away. I needed to be somebody else. And I had never been to Miami. South Beach was where all the gay people were, I was told. MTV's Real World and television and that sort of thing. So I'm going to South Beach. And I gave my parents, God bless them, 2 weeks notice. I was a part owner in the business, and I gave them 2 weeks notice, and I sold everything that I had, and I packed up, and I moved to Miami. And I ended up living here for 16 years. I went to school. I got my degree. I went to graduate school, got my degree. I grew into myself in Miami, and I'm very grateful for the city and for the faces that I see before me, because all of you were a part of that journey. And it really touches my heart. Thank you. Okay, see, now you've made me cry. All right. So really all you need to know about the structure, I guess, of the book is that it switches sort of back and forth. There are objective news articles that take place in 1986, and then the contemporary story takes place about 22 years later. The protagonist is Gray. It's his story. He's telling his story. But what I'm going to read, this first part, is I'm going to read the very first news article that takes place in 1986, and it's about a young boy named Robbie Palmer. Headline: Palmer mother recalls final conversation before son's murder, by Foster Lawrence, Fort Sackville Sentinel writer. Fort Sackville, Indiana. Ruth Palmer will forever remember talking with her son Robbie Palmer the evening of May 2nd. Robbie, 18, temporarily returned home from a party to pick up his favorite Levi's whitewashed denim jacket. He wore that thing all the time, Ruth said. I gave it to him for Christmas last year. I was sitting in this rocking chair here. After he grabbed the jacket, he bent down and kissed me and said he would see me later. I told him, if you're going to be late or not coming home, please call. And he said, of course I will. I love you, Mom. She never saw him again. His decomposing body was found by two boys on three-wheelers 15 days later in a ditch off Highway 41 South near Knox Road. The location is about 10 miles from the party at 25 East 1st Street in Fort Sackville. 2 autopsies failed to determine a cause of death. A police investigation has failed to determine how or where Palmer died. Ruth Palmer has been critical of police and County Prosecutor Dallas Ellerman for not pursuing the investigation with greater professional commitment. During the 2 weeks Robbie was missing, Mrs. Palmer and friends searched for him. She learned about the discovery of his body while watching an Evansville, Indiana television news station broadcast. When the body was found, Robbie was wearing the denim jacket he picked up at home. A cheap gold-colored chain, according to Indiana Coroner Vonderbreck, was worn around his neck. Robbie wore that necklace all the time, Mrs. Palmer said. Vonderbreck says every death investigation has 3 parts. The first part is an autopsy. The second is a police investigation. The third is either a grand jury or coroner's inquest. Since the autopsies and police investigation have produced no leads on Palmer's death, Vonderbreck thinks it's time for a grand jury. Mrs. Palmer has questioned the police investigation and allegations that the party her son attended was homosexual in nature. People can say anything they want because Robbie's not here to defend himself. I had a conversation with Robbie approximately a week before he died. He asked me, Mom, how would you feel if I was gay? I told him I wouldn't love him any less. I wouldn't tell you to go for it because that's not the way I brought you up. I asked him if he was gay. He said, I've never had sex with a man, and I've never had sex with a woman. I do have some awfully funny feelings inside, though. In my opinion, Robbie wasn't gay. Or if he was gay, he wasn't gay very long. Ruth believes he got involved with the wrong crowd. Classmates at school often teased him. I think he was just looking for someone to be his friend, she said.
So I'm going to talk a little about the process and ask Patrick to fill us in. When we first started talking about this book and when you started writing it, it was really a memoir. And this story is based very much on your own experience. And there was a young man in 1986 in your high school who was dumped in a drainage ditch across the state line in Illinois, who was supposedly, or at least believed to be gay.
Perceived. He was
perceived
by the classmates. He was, and I don't know if he was gay or not, but he was perceived to be gay. Yes.
And the murder was never solved. And for you, this was a terrifying experience.
It was an incredibly terrifying experience. I had just had my first same-sex experience just weeks before this particular crime took place. And the thing about it is, people in my hometown, nobody really knows if he was in fact murdered. It was a scandal. It was a tremendous scandal, and there are a lot of people that feel like there was a very concerted effort to cover up the tracks, to cover up this scandal, to cover up the crime, and it was incredibly salacious, and people gossiped, and there was rumor mongering taking place, and it's one of the big disappointments that I have personally with my hometown and my community, because I think that my community, where I grew up, and I loved my childhood. I loved my teen years in spite of the conflict going on with my sexuality. But I think my hometown owes that family, at the very least, an apology. I think that they did not get the justice that they deserved, that their son, that his name was Brent Brand, he certainly didn't get the justice that he deserved. And for a kid that's 17 years old that's struggling with a sexual orientation, it's an incredibly frightening prospect that if you're gay, you might end up dead in a ditch somewhere.
And without justice, too.
And without justice.
So if you got beaten up really badly or something like that, you wouldn't expect the police to be helpful or kind or generous if they thought somehow that there was some homosexual undertone going on. The
atmosphere, the collective sort of idea was, oh, it's just a gay guy. It's just a queer. They don't matter. It's not a big deal. They didn't take into account that this was a human being. This was an 18-year-old boy.
Yeah. So after this time, so this kept you from really coming out and talking about your own, or sort of being open about your own sexuality at the time. And the family had this cafe, this restaurant that was a very successful and popular restaurant in the neighborhood. So you also had that sort of on your shoulders, that you couldn't let them down.
Yeah, well, there were all sorts of things at play there. Certainly, dealing and grappling with the confusion of having had a same-sex relationship, experience to begin with. I look back and I remember being a kid in my grandfather's restaurant, and I remember seeing the grill cook, and I couldn't have been more than 3 years old. And I remember he had an Adam's apple, and I remember thinking, wow, that's really cool. I want one of those when I get older. I want an Adam's apple, And the thing about that is, it was me, the 3-year-old me, identifying with the masculinity of that. So at some level, it's always been there. And then, my family, we had 70 employees. We'd been in business for over a half a century. We had mortgages and people's, livelihoods at stake. And because of the scandal that took place in 1986 and how they practically crucified this family, I didn't know what they would do to my family. And we had lives to consider that at the time I felt were more important than my own.
And that's a big theme in the book, the idea that the family and the livelihood of the family comes first. And so the character Gray sort of buries his needs and his inner hopes for romance and happiness because he feels he needs to protect the family and needs to protect the restaurant. So how do you feel we went about going through this process? I mean, we always talked about this book as a memoir at first, and I loved it as a memoir too. But in the end, it was what's the word? It was sort of piecemeal. It was scenes. It was different events that were very important to you, but they weren't in a way linear. There were stories about the grandfather. There were stories about the family history and the area. Right, but it wasn't. And you came back and forth to Miami several times, and that was also part of the problem with the memoir. Is there wasn't one narrative line, one narrative arc in the story. So we tried to sort of fudge that in a certain way, right? Saying, okay, if we started here, then you only do one trip to Miami, and not go back and. So life is more complicated than fiction generally, right? And you'd never believe the things you see on Oprah if somebody told it to you as a story. But when you see it on the show, because they're telling you it's true, you believe it's true, right? So there's that element also. So what did you think about when you put it together finally and decided, was it easier for you once you decided to approach it as a novel? Was that, or different?
Well, I mean, it was an incredible process. I moved to Miami in 1999. I left my family's business, and between 1999 and this last trip back to Indiana in 2015, it was back and forth quite often. In fact, I took a leave of absence from my teaching position at Carver Middle School. I have a lot of my Carver Middle School colleagues here, and I was gone for almost a year, and the school was incredibly gracious in allowing me to do that, to go back and help my family with the restaurant because my father had fallen very ill. And, I wanted to write this story, and I wanted to do it as a memoir, but what happened was I felt incredibly restricted within the confines of memoir. I was struggling, and I was trying so desperately to get every single thing right, every date, every fact, every conversation, And that's impossible. You can have a conversation with me, I can have a conversation with you, and our perceptions will be different when we walk away. So you and I had a conversation in New York City at one point when I was struggling, and you suggested, let's turn this into a novel. And of course, I was probably, I don't know, 100 pages into the story at that time. I thought, you've got to be kidding me. Turn it into a novel. Oh my God. How, that's starting all over again. And how, and I fought it. I resisted it for quite some time. But when I finally decided to do that, it blew up. My writing absolutely blew up. It opened up. It freed me from that restriction of trying to get every single fact correct. And it also allowed me to bring in more contemporary elements such as reparative therapy. I don't know how many people in here are familiar with that, but reparative therapy is known in many circles as pray the gay away. And it's where parents can send their children to these clinics to fix them, to change their sexual orientation. And these are not licensed clinics. These oftentimes operate based on biblical principles. And so I was able to bring that in, and contemporary issues that I was working with daily at Carver Middle School in terms of our student body. And anybody that says that there's not a gay kid in middle school has no idea what they're talking about, because there are LGBT kids running up and down the halls everywhere. And I really took that on as a project for me to make sure that those kids didn't have to have the same experience I had when I was growing up.
That's really wonderful, I think, and that you took that on. And I loved your feelings of activism that came out through this process too, that you really took this on and are really working hard to help kids. I was amazed by some of the statistics that you shared with me, that 40% of the children who are homeless in the streets of New York identify as gay or transgender. And
yeah,
so
that's a national
statistic. They get kicked out of their homes and wander the streets, not because they're little drug addicts or perverted or something, but because their families reject them. And that's really a terrible, to me, that's a really horrible statistic, I think.
It's a nationwide statistic. 40% of all homeless youth identify as LGBT and were kicked to the streets by their own parents.
Yeah.
The other statistic is that LGBT kids, youth, are 4 to 6 times more likely to commit suicide than their straight counterparts.
And that's a really terrifying statistic.
And over 50% of LGBT kids in middle school and high school are verbally abused daily. Still today. Today.
Well, in places like New York City, I would think, or San Francisco or wherever, where kids, my daughter went to a school where it was kids would walk around, boys with, dressed. They decide I'm Rosa now, and they would wear a dress to school, and everybody was perfectly fine with it. But that's New York City, and that's 2015, and I think that's a special. People run to places like New York or Miami or San Francisco or Chicago because there's more acceptance. But in the states that we're talking about, we're very far from there still, I think.
We're incredibly far. Now, there are, thank God for the internet, thank God for social media, because there are many, many resources now out there that are available to LGBT youth. The Trevor Project, It Gets Better, Glisten. A lot of high schools now have GSAs, Gay Straight Alliances. My high school in my hometown, of Vincennes, Indiana, they have a GSA, and God bless them. And those kids that went to a faculty member and said, we want this here. They marched in the homecoming parade. These kids have more courage than I could ever possibly muster up. And so things are changing.
Right.
But in rural communities, we still have a real problem.
Right. And I wanted to go back to this memoir versus fiction too in the narrative. It's a first-person narrator, Gray's telling us the story. And in the first drafts, going along, there was a lot of anger, right? In the tone, the narrator was angry and was passing a kind of bitter judgment on some of these intolerant people in the town, and about the murder and also about just the way they are. And so how do you think we worked? How did you work through that? Did you work through that through the writing, or do you think through drafts of being able to move farther away from it enough to be able to be less subjective and more objective? Do you understand what I'm talking about with this? You can use a certain word or a certain adjective, and you can change the whole tone of the sentence by just that one word. And in the early drafts, that was happening a little bit.
It was happening a lot. It was happening a lot. And you know that. There was a lot of screaming going on the terrace at night. When someone sits down, in their mind, they're sitting down to tell their story. And especially the experience that I had, the experience that my family had, the experience of growing up in the shadows of this scandal in my community, I didn't realize how angry I was. I was incredibly angry on various levels. And it did take working through, first of all, switching from memoir to fiction certainly alleviated a lot of that, but it also took going through many, many, many drafts. And the more drafts that I wrote and sort of edited and changed, I myself became further removed from the narrative, and I was able to sort of make that leap then to take the judgment out of the narrative. It was an incredibly difficult process. It was stressful. It was there was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that went into that. I've got colleagues that from the English department in here that at some point in time they were sick of hearing the name Kaylee Jones, and they were sick of reading the drafts that I was writing.
But the book is so great now. The new book you're working on, it's so much flowing so much more easily for you. It seems to be coming very masterfully and very confidently, and I think that's because it's not your personal story. So maybe you don't have that feeling of bitterness or anger at all because it's not you. So you're very objective in that book in a way that you learned to be, I think, through writing this book.
I would agree with that. When I was so concerned about getting everything right. I wanted this story to be told, and I wanted it to not only be told, but I wanted it to obviously be well received. But there's a universal message behind Some Go Hungry that if you feel like you're the other, you're not the only one. Everybody in here, in this room, everybody watching on the internet right now has experienced at one time or another feeling as if they were the other. And I just was so concerned with making sure I got it right with Some Go Hungry. I don't have that pressure with the second novel that I'm working on, even though I feel like it has an incredibly valuable message sort of built into it as well. But I am removed from it because it's not my experience.
Yeah. I wanted to tell you this, which I don't know if I told you this before, and then we're going to open it up and have you ask questions. So think about your questions. When I was a teacher in New York City public schools, I taught a creative writing class, and I had one boy. He was from Costa Rica, and he was 14 at the time. And he was the best writer that I ever had as a student. He wrote poems that were he was like a Mozart. And I asked him one time, I said, why do you write so well? And he said, I said, anybody in the family a writer? And he said that his grandfather in Costa Rica was a minister, and he was so good, his sermons were so good that people would come from miles and miles around to hear him. So he had this sort of talent, this ingrained storytelling talent. He ran away from home, and his mom called me, and he wasn't with me. And I called the police and spoke to the guy in the Bronx, to the cop, the detective. I said, this is not a kid who would run away. There's something seriously wrong here. I don't know what it is. A couple days later, his mom called me and said that they were sending him to Pray the Gay Away camp, or they called it something else, reparative therapy camp. This is many years ago. He was 14, so this is in the early 90s. And I begged her. I said, please don't do that. Please don't do that. And they sent him, and I never heard from him again. Many years went by, and he found me on the internet. 15 years later, 10, 15 years later, he was in his late 20s, and he said to me, he sent me an email, he found my email address, and he said, you're the only person that ever told me that I was worth anything or that I was good at anything. And then he killed himself. and he left my phone number on the wall of his room where he killed himself. And his mom found that, just the phone number, no name or anything. And my phone rang. This is when I still had a house line, landline. My phone was ringing, no messages, just all these hang-ups. And I thought something's weird going on. So I finally picked up the phone, and it was his mother. And she said, we didn't know whose number this was, but it's the only thing he wrote was your number on the wall of his room. And I will never forgive myself for the rest of my life that I didn't do something more, that I didn't know. And it's not, you don't have the power to take control of a situation like that. You're not the parent, you're just the teacher, but that affected me. I think about him all the time, and that affected me terribly. So when I read that scene in your book, I was devastated by that. But to me, it's healing. It's very healing for me to see that in writing, and to see that you're taking it on, and that people are taking this on, because an injustice was committed beyond belief on this beautiful, beautiful young man. And it really devastated me. It's one of the great losses of my life, So I just wanted to say that, because I don't think I didn't mention this the last time we had a talk, but that part of the book was based on things that you read, but that wasn't a personal experience, right? That character...
No, you're talking about...
Yes.
About Trace?
Yes.
Yeah,
Trace. They send him away.
Yeah, Trace was not part of my personal experience, but Trace is a part of my having taught with the Miami-Dade public school system for 12 years. Trace is a part of my having worked with GSAs. Trace is a part of my having worked with the Safe Schools, South Florida. My colleague, one of my co-teachers and colleagues here, Jackie Panee, and I attended and this is why I love the Miami-Dade County Public School System so much, because they work with Safe Schools, South Florida, and they work with GSAs, and they work with GLSEN to offer professional development for teachers, for faculty, for counselors, for administrators, to give them the opportunity to hear these kids tell their stories. And Jackie and I went to that first professional development workshop, and she and I both walked. It was a day-long thing, and it was at Coral Gables Congregational in their event room there. And she and I both walked away from that event changed for good. And so Trace was sort of born from those conversations and those experiences.
And he's so real. He's a wonderful character. He's such a real character. And he wasn't in the memoir, but he was in the novel. It's interesting. Please, questions from the audience?
Yes.
How is your family, your community in Indiana reacting to your success, your openness about yourself, and
I don't.
life, I hope?
Well, thank you. That's an awesome question, by the way. I don't live in my hometown. I live about an hour and a half south. In my 20s, I was with my boyfriend at the time, and then he and I broke up, and he moved to Nashville. I moved to Miami, and about 2 years ago, we got back together. So I live in southern Indiana, again, with him, just about an hour and a half south of my hometown. In terms of how the book is being received, the support has been incredibly overwhelming. On social media, people have been making phone calls, they've been sending me texts, private messages, emails, that sort of thing. People are ready for this story to be told. And the thing that's been incredible to me is I'm getting a lot of emails from parents, mostly mothers, but parents from the county, from Knox County, Vincennes is in Knox County in southern Indiana, from Knox County that have raised or in the process of raising children who happen to be gay, and saying, thank you. Thank you for writing this book, because you're telling my son or you're telling my daughter's story.
I think was very interested to listen how do you move from a memoir to a novel. So how liberating it was for you, and opening and everything. I'm not going to tell you how to do your marketing for your book, but I think it's key. It's key that everywhere it says that this is based on a real story, because I think that it's very meaningful for people to put a face, to hear your voice. I mean, to realize this is just not a novel. You know, this is just somebody's life. Or
Yes,
some people's
yeah,
life.
you're absolutely right.
Keep that going. I
yeah,
mean, it's
it's-
not a memoir, but it's your life.
Yeah, no, it's not just a novel. I mean, this has my heart. This has my heart in every single page of it, and most importantly, the character Robbie Palmer, who is that his experience is inspired certainly by Brent Brand, my classmate. I was a junior, he was a senior at the time, and as horrific and as tragic as that crime is, the incredibly sad thing about it is there are thousands and thousands and thousands of Brent Brands and Robbie Palmers today whose stories will never be told because their voices have been taken away from them. I really feel like Some Go Hungry is an opportunity for those young men and women, those LGBT teens who've had their voices taken from them, for them to tell their story.
And if you go on like Amazon, for example, and look at the comments, that have been posted or reviews, there's so much love in those. Most of the reviews are unbelievable from parents and friends and people who, from that community, who remember that crime, who remember the situation. It's almost like a healing that's going on, and there's so few bad reactions. We were really kind of nervous about it because people remember this story and are still, some people are still very upset about it and don't want this to be talked about at all. And well, some of them are getting old, but one of them threatened your dad not long ago, literally threatened him.
I mean, these Indiana people live.
Yeah, I would. Unfortunately, there are people from my generation that were there. They were classmates of mine. They experienced this. They perhaps experienced it as a heterosexual, not as a homosexual, and so maybe it didn't have the impact on them that it had on me. And Kaylee had the opportunity to meet a former classmate of mine when we were in New York City, who rarely ever goes back to Vincennes to visit because it's just not something that he feels the need to do, because that was a different life for him. He has a wonderful life with his husband of 15 years, and it's just something that he doesn't care to ever visit again. And unfortunately, there are people from my generation that they're a very small, they're a minority, they're local, they are incredibly vocal, and they are upset. They are incredibly upset by this, and because they're saying I'm opening old wounds, that I'm disrespecting the family, that I'm not taking their feelings into consideration, and the last thing that I would ever want to do is to hurt Brent's family. I can't imagine what their life was like during that time period, but I also, in terms of the experience, for instance, that Judy Shepard with Matthew Shepard, at some point we have to take this story and we have to turn it around and make sure that nobody else ever has to go through this experience again. And that's really the ultimate goal of Some Go Hungry, is to take this story and to make sure that another Brent Brand and another Robbie Palmer never happens again.
And yet, as Flannery O'Connor said, don't get on a soapbox to tell a story, right? So it's so important that it's really a novel, and it's a beautiful story, and it's very objective. It's told in a very objective tone. And so there's no judgment passed on the people who are responsible. It's very, very well done. So nobody can say that you're standing there screaming, right? You did it with such elegance, and compassion for everybody in the book, that it's very moving. It's really a beautiful, moving testament to your personal experience and to the experience of the other characters in the story. And those towns are so, they still carry, that it's so easy to feel that shame. And it doesn't matter if it's about being gay or if it's about just being different. The idea of the shame that can be passed down too. And, you broke out of that, and you had very good support. You have a wonderful, wonderful family, wonderful brother and mom, and your stepdad. I mean, they've been so supportive and wonderful, but there's so many kids who have that shame put on them and are not supported by their families. And I think it's just a disaster for them when they feel this, that there's something wrong with them, right? There's something wrong. It's not okay. And I think that your book really approaches that in such a beautiful way that you don't for a second think there's anything wrong with anybody. You know, they're humans.
Even Pastor Darrell.
Even Pastor Darrell, who's afraid. He's filled with fear.
He's filled with
He's
fear.
filled with fear. He's
Exactly.
unable to look at what he's unable to be honest with himself because he's so shamed and so fearful. And that's a really interesting thing too. Is you know how brave you were to finally sit down and say, well, I'm gonna tell the story and I'm gonna tell it the way I remember it, and I'm not gonna be afraid. You know, and I think that takes a lot of guts. I really do. Yes.
Yes.
So Patrick, did you think? I mean, we talked together, so you know. I know.
This is my friend Charlotte.
Yes.
Charlotte, that's her wife, Jenny, and they have 3 adorable children.
So did you think, as a teacher, that this might be on a book list one day for high school? Like you know, maybe even like Harvey
If
Milk.
I only knew somebody that was in charge of the book list at a school somewhere.
Well, even Harvey Milk High in New York or something, you know, like that.
I have
I-
requested biographies on it, so they could be a little.
I would absolutely love for that to happen. And for instance, Kaylee called me before the New York City launch last week, and she said, I'm talking at the Gay Men's Health Crisis.
Yep.
Correct? Yes, the Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York City, and she had some of the books because we had extra in case we sold out at Blue Stockings in New York, which we sold out at Blue Stockings in New York. And she said, "Can I take 4 of these because I want to take them to the Gay Men's Health Crisis?" And I said, "Absolutely." She's like, "I'll pay you for them." I'm like, "No, take them because I want the book out there. I want it to be, you know, at the Al Forney Center. I want it to be at the Gay Men's Health Crisis. I've sent the book to Homestead, to their GSA teacher and the students. Michael Kropp has a copy of the book. You know, any GSAs, anything like that, I want to work with the LGBT organizations hand in hand and say, you know, I'm here, I'm willing to lend my writing, I'm willing to lend my voice, I'm willing to do whatever it is I can so that together we can make a difference. And I think if it were to end up on a book list at a school somewhere, that would be phenomenal.
It would be wonderful to see you back in Miami and do a reading in the school.
Yeah.
I think that would be, yeah. Can we do it in November, though? Perhaps? Yeah, November, maybe? Yes.
Any other questions, please? We'd be happy to. You can't all be. Yes.
Okay, Patrick, what's the new book about?
Well, the new book takes place in a fictional community called Woodfern, and it's in Kentucky. It's about 30 minutes outside of Louisville. And it's about it's contemporary. It takes place after the Supreme Court ruling on marriage equality. And I have 2 characters, Adrian and Kyler. They're married, and they run an event company in this small town called Reserved. And it's a wedding destination, and they're getting ready for their first same-sex wedding in this small town of Woodford, Kentucky. And I have this really great character named Mrs. Frankfurt. Mrs. Frankfurt is the matriarch of this town, and she's very, you know, Dior and Gucci and you know, dressed to the nines, and she pops around town in her golf cart everywhere. She's all over the place, and she rules the roost of Woodford. So yeah, I'm excited about it. I'm about 4 or 5 chapters into it right now, and
But tell them there's a major turning point, which is at the adopted boys.
well, I don't want to tell all of
Oh,
that.
okay.
I don't want to tell all of that.
It's just a great. That's your pitch. That's the hook.
Yes, that's the hook. There's you know, in terms of the hero's journey, there's a stranger that comes to town. Let's just say
Yes.
that. Yes.
Awesome.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
But I would like to know about the title of the book.
Some Go Hungry?
Yes.
Originally, the working title was called Feeding the Christians. the story behind that is that that was sort of my gosh, what do you want to call it? That was sort of my thing on Sunday. People would call, friends would call, or after having been out Friday night or Saturday, going to the gay bar on Saturday night, staying out till 3 o'clock in the morning, and being at the restaurant at 9 o'clock in the morning, and your friends who are sleeping in on Sunday calling and saying, well, what are you doing? Oh, I'm just feeding the Christians, that sort of thing. And it really was meant sort of, tongue in cheek, but it was also this idea of feeding the Christians to the lions, sort of the persecution kind of thing. But the Kaylee and Johnny Temple, who is the owner and publisher of Akashic Books, Kaylee's imprint is with Akashic Books. They had a conversation, and really she sort of called and said, let's rethink this a little bit. And so Some Go Hungry comes from Paul's letter, one of Paul's letters to the Corinthians. And it's in the, I guess, what would you call that? Not the foreword, but no, I mean in the book, in Some Go Hungry. Yeah. I'm not asking you Bible questions, no. It's not the preface, really. It's what would you call it?
I'm losing my mind.
Epigraph, yeah, the epigraph. Thank you. Yes,
Thank you.
Dr. Sutton, FIU, right over here. Yeah, he got it. Yes.
Epigraph.
The epigraph. So I actually have two epigraphs there. I have one from Truman Capote, because my favorite Truman Capote book is Other Voices, Other Rooms. And I have that, and then I have the excerpt from Corinthians.
Which is, basically he's saying that there's no feeling of community between people because they're all so selfish, and you sit there stuffing yourself while these go hungry and those while these get drunk, and it's a really wonderful quote.
It's about division within the house of God,
and
division within the church.
Yeah.
And, there's divisiveness there while you're allowing one to go hungry and another to get drunk. Yes.
Sorry you spoke about this in the first few minutes because I did come in a little late, but you did so much in terms of trying to help heal the community, and people are responding. What about for yourself, the sort of catharsis of writing this? What did it do for you now? And you moved back home or close to home. What, on a personal level, did it do for you at the same time that you were really reaching out to young people and to communities and, doing a very public kind of service?
It was, that's an incredible question, and it was incredibly cathartic for me, certainly. And to give you a little sort of anecdote, we closed the restaurant, my family and I closed the restaurant, our actual restaurant, in 2006. And after 55 years, what people don't understand is that's like a death in the family. It was my identity, it was my family's identity, it certainly was my father's identity. He'd been involved with it since he was a little kid. And my family and I went through the typical stages of grief. We closed the restaurant. I came back in October of 2006, and I really didn't feel like myself probably until that next summer. And I sort of either holed myself up at Magnum or in my condo, and that was it. And where? Or in Lake Worth, yes. But there's a river. When you're going up Highway 41 north from Evansville, which is the third largest city in Indiana, and Vincennes, my hometown, is an hour north of that. When you're going up Highway 41 north, there's a river. It's called the White River. And from 2006 until probably February, when I would go home to visit, when I would cross that river, the anxiety, I would feel the constriction in my chest. It would tighten up. That anxiety would begin to build. In February, I received the box, my first shipment of books for Some Go Hungry. And I didn't even know I had received them. My boyfriend, came home for lunch. He's like, do you know you have a box out on the porch? And I opened that box, and there they were. And the next time that I went to Vincennes, the anxiety was gone. It was completely gone. It had dissipated. So it was incredibly healing on a personal level. Yes.
Receive some justice.
Does Gray receive justice in the book?
Oh, the kid.
Oh, the kid. Gray is he's the protagonist.
I I think she means Robbie Palmer. Do
you mean
the boy
the boy that was
killed?
murdered?
Yeah.
No.
No, and I think that's truth. You know, the truth is that there is no way to fix that or to solve it.
But at least to acknowledge this injustice is something good for him, for his family.
Yes. We hope so, but we don't know yet. The family's very gun shy, and they really don't want this opened up again in a lot of ways.
And rightfully so. I mean, I can understand, you know, if that had happened to my brother, I don't want to relive that tragedy at all. And I don't want to feel as if somebody is treading on sacred ground, so to speak. But again, in sort of very much the same way that Judy Shepard did it with Matthew, there's just this compelling need in me, having worked with LGBT teens and kids, that this was an experience that I had. This was my experience, and I wrote a novel inspired by my experience of growing up in the shadows of this scandal.
The point, too, is that when this boy was killed, it became an opportunity for not just the newspapers, but for the churches to really attack the gay community. So it's like a woman who's raped and then accused that it's her own fault because she wore a short skirt. It's that exact mentality. And so here's this boy lying in a ditch for 2 weeks. Nobody knew where he was. And it becomes his fault. It's those queer people's fault. And it became an opportunity for a lot of fire and brimstone sermonizing, too, which is in the book, and makes the injustice that much more horrible. So the mother not only lost her son and got no justice in terms of catching anybody who was involved, but then she had to listen to the papers and the preachers and the neighbors all saying that, you know, it's because he was gay. It's because he hung out with those people. You know, so she had it from all ends, you know, and that's a very important part of this. Matthew Shepard, the whole country got behind his mom, really, in a fundamental way. There was a sea change in the way Americans looked at that. Don't you think so?
Oh, no, I
There was
agree.
a real...
Yeah, absolutely. You know, it was Matthew Shepard's beating and his death that changed this for everyone. And you know, unfortunately, Brent Brand was you know, more than a decade before Matthew Shepard. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of Brent Brands that died incredibly tragic deaths, whose families experienced the most horrific thing a family could ever experience, and nobody knows their stories because it was before Matthew Shepard. And it was, thank God, Judy Shepard saying, I've had enough. Yeah. I've had enough. This is not going to happen on my watch any longer. And for me, having grown up in that kind of environment, you know, when I remember sitting in the restaurant. And seeing a small article in the Vince & Son commercial about a young boy in Laramie, Wyoming, that was tied to a fence and beaten, and he was lying in a coma, and the nation didn't know what was going to happen. And the article directly below that was about a fundamentalist Kansas church that had a haunted house, and they were using AIDS victims as the opportunity to scare the children coming to that haunted house. God. Those two things right there are what I incorporated into the book. And those two things are still happening today. But fortunately, we have people that are rising up and saying, no more, we're done with this. And just by the mere action of buying Some Go Hungry and reading it and showing up here tonight, the activity and the response on social media is telling both Kaylee and me that there's a whole bunch of people out there that are completely done with this. We're not having it any longer.
Yeah. Any last questions? Patrick, yes, please.
Question, but as a trivia buff, I wanted to share and have you share with people a little of the history of Vincennes, that it was the capital of the Northwest Territories after the revolution we got our independence. and it was settled by the French, and then when the British occupied it, it became Fort Sackville. And so you made it fictional, but it still has, and then there's a statue on a bridge crossing from Indiana to Illinois of Abraham Lincoln and his family as they made it. So it has a lot of history there.
Yeah, the history is ingrained into you from the moment that you reach kindergarten all the way through your senior year in high school. Many field trips are taken every year to the George Rogers Clark National Memorial. And there was a movie there about George Rogers Clark and, and the capture of Fort Sackville. And I knew the movie verbatim after about my 6th grade year. So yes, there's a very rich, very important history there. And Kaylee and I, when we were having these conversations, there's also, because of that, this sort of pioneer spirit that, this is our encampment, this is our land, and we've sort of been, yeah.
You go away, stay away, we're fine here.
Yeah.
One last question.
As a comment, I just want to thank you. This is my 22nd year of teaching, and I've experienced many of the things that you've talked about, where a principal prayed over a student in a classroom because she wanted to start a GSA. I had a plant thrown at me by a principal saying, get the F out of my classroom, out of my building, as a teacher who wanted to sponsor that GSA. So I've had these experiences myself with students, and letters from students when I moved away from New Orleans saying, thank you, you saved my life. And I never knew. And now with Facebook, like Facebook posts from kids in Virginia, thank you very much. Did you know I was gay in high school? And I'm like, I'm not going to answer that. But anyway, but now I teach with Florida Virtual School, and it's really amazing because these kids now have a haven because they don't have to go to that building anymore and be made fun of, to be like poked fun of, to be put in garbage cans, to be their heads flushed in toilets. And they've told me these stories because I talked to them individually on the phone, and they tell me these stories about how they're so happy that they can be at home and they don't have to go into that environment anymore. They can have the friends that they want to have who treat them with respect. And so luckily with technology and innovation, we're creating spaces, safe spaces for young people. And thank you very much for telling the story.
So Patrick is going to read a short section from the first chapter, and then please join us for our reception and buy books.
Okay. So as I said earlier, the book is sort of broken up between these sort of objective news articles and then the contemporary story that takes place about 22 years later. So what I chose to read was from chapter 1, and chapter 1 is really the introduction, obviously, of the community, of the restaurant, and of the protagonist, the main character, Gray. And I said earlier about that stranger that sort of comes to town. It's sort of a recurring theme here. Chapter 1. My first Sunday back from South Beach, I was greeted by our customers at Daniel's Family Buffet as if I were the long-lost prodigal son. He's returned to God's country, it seemed they were saying. I was met with good wishes from many of our regular customers. Welcome back, we've missed you. The place wasn't the same with you gone. Our restaurant stood next to the Walmart Supercenter on a 3-acre commercial outlot in a 13,000 square foot building with seating for 430 patrons. It had a main dining room where each of the 3 buffets, hot bar, salad bar, and dessert bar, was located near the kitchen, with an additional banquet room for private parties. On Sundays, both rooms were packed. The line to enter wrapped around the north perimeter of the main dining room from the front entrance to the cashier's desk. Customers paid before they entered. Oftentimes, the line extended out the door and around the corner. On Sundays, it was not uncommon for customers to experience an hour's wait. Daniel's Family Buffet was a well-oiled machine, cranking out fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans, along with other meats, vegetables, casseroles, soups, various salads, and desserts, not to mention homemade pies and cobblers topped with ice cream. Our restaurant was the epitome of Southern Indiana home cooking and hospitality. Waitresses in black slacks, black aprons, and burgundy polo shirts served up smiles and the occasional sarcastic remark in response to randy old men. Most importantly, they dished out platefuls of Midwestern charm, complemented by tall glasses of sweet iced tea or ice-cold Coca-Colas. Managing the restaurant had fallen upon me. Dad's health was declining, Mom was consumed with his care, and my little brother Cameron was attending the University of Southern Indiana. Growing up, Cam had bussed tables and run the cash register, but he never managed the entire operation. He didn't understand it, and he didn't particularly want the job. Neither did I, but I didn't feel I had a choice. Dad had undergone surgery on his left lung only a year earlier after having been diagnosed with asbestosis, a result of his naval service during the Vietnam War. I felt obligated to stay in Fort Sackville and manage the restaurant for him. Our financial well-being and the fate of the restaurant now rested on me. A customer I did not expect to see my first day back, one who'd never been a regular, ever, was Daryl Stone. Daryl and his family must have arrived in Fort Sackville while I was on vacation. I hadn't seen him since high school. Now he was sitting in our restaurant with a wife and 2 kids at a foretop on the opposite end of the expansive dining room. Over the years, I'd heard Daryl had become a born-again Christian while studying theology at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. I heard somewhere that he had married and had children. I also heard he was returning to Fort Sackville with his family to take the position of youth pastor for the Wabash Valley Baptist Church. Apparently, he'd become aware of the position during a Christian musical theater conference conducted at Liberty, the same conference one of our bussers, Trace Thompson, had attended. Daryl applied and got the job. Trace, who'd only met Daryl the one time, was thrilled. A youth pastor at Wabash Valley Church? It didn't seem possible. He was male model handsome, as if lifted by the Falwellian empire from the centerfold of a glossy men's magazine and primed for his own Christian television network. Both beneath his pomade and polish, however, I could see the athletic teenager I'd once fallen head over heels for, the one that had come to my basement window in the middle of the night. He'd matured from black Ray-Bans, a bare chest, and board shorts, to stylish silver spectacles, a turtleneck, and taupe tweed sports jacket with corduroys. I headed toward his table. "Daryl," I said, somewhat startling him, "I heard you were moving back. I haven't seen you in ages. How have you been?" "Hey, Gray." He stood to shake my hand. "Gray, I'd like you to meet my wife, Rebecca. Rebecca, this is Gray. Gray and I were classmates at Harrison." Classmates? Daryl sat down and placed his hand on the back of the chair next to him. "This is Isaac. Over there is Jacob." Did he really just say classmates? "Nice to meet you, Gray," Rebecca said. She had plain features, wore little makeup, and was dressed in a conservative consignment shop kind of style. She reminded me of that girl in every high school classroom who blends in with her surroundings, the kind of girl years later at the class reunion one never remembers. Their twin boys looked 7 or 8 years old. They were unresponsive to the introduction. Each had his teeth sunk deep into the dark meat of a fried chicken leg. "Looks like the boys are enjoying themselves," I said, trying to clear the word classmates from my mind. He could have said, "We were best friends at Harrison," or "We were best friends once." "Oh, yes, chicken legs and noodles are their favorite," Rebecca said. "So last I heard you were living in Virginia," I said to his wife. "Have you adjusted to Fort Sackville? Must be quite a change." "It's lovely. Everyone's so friendly. The church welcomed us with open arms," she said, taking a napkin from the table to wipe pieces of fried chicken from her twin boys' cheeks. Our conversation was interrupted by the restaurant's public address intercom telling me I was needed in the kitchen. "Excuse me, it's the same old grind here. This place keeps me hopping." Once in the kitchen, I got stuck helping the cooks catch up on frying chicken. The vegetable oil in one of the fryers had burned, which required that the fryer be boiled out and replenished with fresh oil. Boiling out a fryer was a process and often forced the fry cook to fall behind. He did. I was unable to return to the dining room for some time. When I did, Daryl and his family had finished their meal. He was waiting near the front door for Rebecca and the boys to come out of the restrooms, facing the wall of photographs. When Dad bought the restaurant from Grandpa Colin, he and Mom began framing and hanging pictures that captured the 50-plus years my family had been in the restaurant business. Because the restaurant was a prominent patron of the Harrison High School Athletic Society, there were many pictures of high school heroes and local sports moments. Daryl seemed to be gazing at a photograph of Robbie Palmer and himself, both 17 years old, at a county high school golf tournament sponsored by the restaurant. In the photograph, Daryl and Robbie stood side by side, Robbie's left hand propped upon his golf club, Daryl's left forearm resting on Robbie's right shoulder. Both wore big smiles. The photograph date, July 1985. Robbie had been in my accounting class at Harrison High. I was a junior, he was a senior, skinny, always smiling. We weren't friends, but we were friendly. Daryl's girlfriend, Shani, sat behind Robbie in the row next to mine. She was a blonde with 80s MTV hair and shoulder pads under her bold print sweaters. She was a curious girl, always asking him questions. One spring day, she asked Robbie about the necklace he was wearing. He turned in his chair to face her. "Shh, come here," he said. Shani leaned closer to Robbie. "It's from this guy I'm dating." "A guy? You're dating a guy? Really?" Shani asked. Talking about homosexuality in the 1980s was a frightening and potentially dangerous prospect, especially at school. In October, Rock Hudson had died from an AIDS-related illness after disclosing he was a homosexual, and Rock Hudson AIDS jokes were rampant in our school's hallways and locker rooms. The nation was swept up in AIDS panic, and local folks referred to it in a barely audible whisper as gay cancer. In Fort Sackville, being gay meant one had AIDS, and having AIDS meant one was gay. "Where's he from?" Shani whispered, looking around to see if anyone heard her. "Greenfield, Indiana," Robbie said. "Where's that?" Shani asked. "Outside Indianapolis. He just finished his freshman year at Fort Sackville Community College," Robbie said. "He's going to stay for my graduation, maybe for the summer if he can find a job." "What's his major?" "Law enforcement." "What do you guys do?" "Mostly just hang out at his apartment. There's a party the weekend after his finals. He's taking me to that." "Have you guys kissed?" "Shh, yes." I sensed irritation in Robbie's voice. "What was it like?" "Jesus, Shani, enough with the Inquisition," I said. Robbie smiled, then turned forward in his chair to face our teacher. Everyone in school assumed Robbie was gay, but he was not out. A handful of hairdressers, Shani called them, were the only other gay people in Fort Sackville she knew. I concealed my own struggle with my orientation by trying to fit in with the school's jocks, the popular kids. I dated girls. When dating didn't work, I took close female friends to proms or cotillions. I watched the boys, the athletes, like my best friend Daryl Stone, who was in Robbie's senior class, walk down the halls of Harrison. I wondered what it must be like for him. I fantasized about having sex with a guy, but I spent most of my time trying to disguise my feelings, fearful of being found out while also trying to keep control of my raging hormones. Robbie, at least, seemed to be figuring out who he was. No apologies from him, yet he did not force his sexuality on his classmates. They, in turn, kept him in his place with their homophobic comments. For the most part, he remained silent, yet he felt safe with Shani. I understand now he was struggling with the same issues as I was, but I never befriended him, that guy in accounting class, fearing I'd be called a faggot by association. Too much of my time, it seemed, was spent thinking about the past, my family's past, the restaurant's past, my hometown's past, and Robbie Palmer's murder, replaying various events over and over in my mind, analyzing them, dissecting them. I spent only as much time in the present as required, and rarely did I think about the future. The future scared the hell out of me. The framed photograph in the restaurant was the only reminder, it seemed, that Robbie had ever existed. I often wondered what customers thought when they saw the picture, if they thought of him at all. Robbie's murder was the biggest scandal Fort Sackville had ever experienced. Folks rarely spoke about it, and if they dared to, the allusion was quick and whispered, like saying gay cancer or AIDS. Rumors of threats that had been made against his life often accompanied the stories about Robbie Palmer, and now here he was, Daryl, standing before this photo of himself with Robbie, his face a pale, inscrutable mask. I wondered what Daryl thought. Did he ever think about him? "Seems like a lifetime ago. I guess many of these are," I said. My voice startled Daryl. He quickly regained his composure. "There's quite a history here," Daryl said, turning to me. "I figured you'd have left Fort Sackville by now." "No, I'm here. Dad's health has been declining. He's had a pretty serious lung surgery this past summer. So, you do what you gotta do." "You do what God calls you to do." Daryl's face was stern, the same angry expression his father had worn that summer day when we got caught driving his Corvette. Rebecca and the twins reappeared, joining Daryl near the photographs. Trying to disregard Daryl's pronouncement, I said, "I think we might be coming to church for Christmas service. Trace says he has a solo." "He's such a good Christian boy. A lovely voice." "Yes, we have a lovely voice. God has called him," Rebecca said. Daryl placed his arm around her shoulders. "Yes, we have big plans for Trace." "He's a damn good worker, I know that. We could use more like him on the floor," I said. "Trace has a future. He will serve the Lord," Daryl replied. "Right. Well, I look forward to hearing him sing. It was nice meeting you, Rebecca. You too, boys." Isaac and Jacob still did not acknowledge me, little brats. "I'll look for your face in the pew on Sunday," Daryl said before he followed his wife and boys out the front door. 1 year at Christmas is enough, I thought.
Thank you, Patrick. Quick note to our internet audience watching at home, there is still time for you to call the number on your screen, and we could ship a copy of Some Girl Hungry to wherever you are in the United States free of charge. For those of you here in the house, we have the book as well as many other Kaylee Jones books related titles on display and for sale in the front room over there. Patrick and Kaylee are going to be signing over here at the table to the left of the two stools. We do have the reception back there in the corner. And this has been such a pleasure for us. I want to thank our great guest introducer, Ms. Kaylee Jones. Guest interviewer, I should say. Our guest interviewer, Kaylee Jones. And please give another hand to J. Patrick Redmond. Thank you very much. Thank you.